Thanks, Heidi. Appreciate it. Well, welcome again, everyone. We do really appreciate you joining us this morning, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. This is something that is a particular sort of passion for me and really is at the basis of the work that we do at Project Success, so I'm excited to be able to share with you this morning. I will try to keep an eye on the chat box, but Heidi will also be monitoring as well, so if we miss something, just make sure to put it in again. All right. So like Heidi said, my name is Ashley Quick. I do work with Public Consulting Group as a subject matter expert, but I also was a special education teacher for 10 years prior to that. So that is my background. That's the context that I bring to this. And then for the last 4 years, I've been supporting teachers and administrators of students with significant disabilities through the Project Success Resource Center. I won't spend a lot more time on my background than that, but just wanted to give you a quick overview of that. And our team enjoys sharing our families during our presentation. So that is my family, my husband Tony, and my almost 10-year-old twins, Aaliyah and Jackson. All right, so here's a brief look at what we'll be covering today. I'll try not to move too quickly, but I do tend to go fast sometimes when I get excited. So if you ever need me to slow down, just pop that in the chat or ask me to repeat something. I'll start by sort of just laying the groundwork for the remainder of this presentation today, just kind of laying some context. And then we'll move into the building blocks of an inclusive mindset. And this is then going to lead up to providing meaningful access for students with disabilities and strategies to support high expectations for them. And then we'll hopefully wrap up with some time for questions and some sharing of additional resources. When you see that blue speech bubble icon somewhere on the slide, that means that I'm going to be specifically sort of soliciting input from you, either in the chat or feel free to unmute if you'd like. But that indicates that we'll be sort of sharing thoughts, ideas, answering questions in that way. So anytime you see that speech bubble, just know that we're looking for some input from you all as participants. So this whole idea of presuming competence in students with disabilities stems from really a broad research base, and it's supported also by federal legislation and guidance, including the Dear Colleague Letter, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that I'm sure as administrators you're all quite familiar with. We know that presuming competence in students with disabilities, it's what's best for them, but it's also nice to have that research base, that legislative support as well. All of those pieces are really in line and are growing as we get more research on students with disabilities that this really is the best way to support educating them, is to presume competence. And we'll talk more in just a minute about what I mean when I say presume competence. But in general, really, the simple fact is that when we expect students to learn, or more precisely, when we expect that students have the ability to learn, they're more likely to do so. This doesn't mean that expecting students to learn guarantees success on a comparable level to their non-disabled peers, but it does give them a better chance at getting closer to that target. And this, of course, relies heavily then on educators promoting that equity and providing that meaningful access for students, no matter the type of disability that they have, no matter the intensity of the disability that has been identified. These students really depend on us as the educators to provide that access. That's where in this graphic here, you'll see the idea of shared responsibility is key when we're talking about meaningful inclusion of students with significant disabilities, and really any student with a disability, right? But I'll be zoning in a little bit on students with more significant disabilities today. That shared responsibility piece has really developed over time. There was a time in special education where general education students were in general education settings, special education students were in special education settings. It's very separate. Gen ed teachers do gen ed teacher things, special ed teachers do special ed teacher things. It's very separate, right? But now we're really getting to a point more and more where it's going to take, it's sort of the, it takes a village, right? It takes a team of people to educate our students. And so the responsibility is now being shared. It's no longer just the special educator who's in charge of making sure all these things happen. We're all really going to be drawing on the expertise of general educators, the expertise of the special educators, the expertise of the administrators, even paraprofessionals, related service providers, all of these people, both at the building level, the district level, even families, we need their input as well, right? To ensure that we're working together to maintain high expectations for our students with disabilities, and that we're considering meaningful access in everything we do. That includes the curriculum, instruction, assessments, settings that they're in, experiences that they're provided, peers that they're exposed to. All of these things are part of making sure that we're making inclusion meaningful for our students with disabilities. And then, of course, all of that's sort of tied together when we implement things like universal design for learning and multi-tiered system of supports. So before we move forward, but with all these things in mind, I want to consider these questions. One, what are the rights of students with disabilities? And what are our responsibilities as educators of students with disabilities? So this, you'll see the Navy chat bubble there. This is where I'd like to hear from you all in the chat box. What do you consider to be the rights of students with disabilities, this foundational right? And then what does that mean about our responsibilities as educators of those students? Give you a second to kind of formulate your thoughts there and get those in the chat. I will say that FAPE. Yeah, Stephanie just says FAPE, right? I mean, that's it in the smallest of nutshells, right? It's students have a right to a free and appropriate public education, and that doesn't matter. The level of their disability doesn't matter. The particular disability they're identified with doesn't matter. The significance of it, they still have access to a free and appropriate public education. Even if it's very difficult for us as educators to figure out how to provide that, that doesn't mean they don't get to have it, right? So I think that, yeah, I mean, that really just kind of sums it up. It really does. It boils down to students having the right to access. You're going to hear me say access a million times today. And when we're talking about access, that means access to content, gen ed content, gen ed settings, gen ed peers, gen ed experiences. And then educators then have the responsibility to provide that access and facilitate that access, even if it means doing something different than what we've always done, even if it means doing something more difficult than we've always done. That's really what it boils down to. Students have the right to access, and then it's our responsibility as the educator to provide and facilitate that access. So here's another way of thinking about that. This slide that you see here is the top half of a graphic that addresses sort of mindset in general when it comes to inclusive practices. And we'll look at the bottom half here on the next slide. There are some people in education who worry that doing things differently for students with disabilities is somehow unfair to students without identified disabilities. And I really feel like we need to let go of that idea that of fair, right? We're not thinking about fair being the same thing as equal or same even, right? This graphic does a good job of breaking down this idea that fair isn't always equal by comparing education to medicine. So if you consider this group of children here, they're going to the doctor with really a variety of medical needs, right? They've got a scraped knee, a broken arm, a cough, and the doctor is prescribing the same treatment, cough medicine, for all of them. This approach is certainly equal if we're thinking about things being equal, but it means that only one of those children actually gets what they need, which is ultimately then unfair to all the rest, right? So doing things differently, providing different things to different students is not unfair, right? It's meeting their needs and it's being equitable, but we need to let go of this idea of equality and sameness. So comparing that then to education specifically, and especially thinking about our students with more significant disabilities, we wouldn't be providing the same educational treatment to students, with really a wide variety of needs based on their disabilities. And fair wouldn't mean that the students with and without disabilities receive the same instruction. So when we're talking about putting students with disabilities in an inclusive general education environment, we're not saying they need the same thing that the general education students need. That is not what we're saying at all. That would not be equitable. They do need differentiated instruction or different services, supports, and things like that, but they still have the right to access that gen ed environment and those gen ed peers and those experiences, right? So the point is not necessarily, for instance, that a student with a disability or a significant disability is doing the same volume of work or the same complexity of work as a student without identified disabilities. The point is that they have equal access to that same content. So thinking about what that means more broadly for inclusion in general and how we understand what we mean when we say inclusion. For a long time now, for many years, I think inclusion of students with disabilities has really been a given, right? That everyone's pretty much on board in general with the idea of inclusion. there's varying degrees of fidelity and success with that process, but I think it's a pretty common thing these days, right? But it's important that we think about what kind of inclusion are we talking about when we're thinking about ensuring equal access for these students. So in the past, we may have patted ourselves on the back just for getting those students with disabilities in a gen ed classroom, right? That physical inclusion. Their body, it's physically there, it's in the same place as their peers without identified disabilities. That is a critical step to get their body in the same place, but that's not where we stop, right? Because that's only physical access. That doesn't bring in any other types of access that we might be talking about. Other elements of inclusion that we need to address. These students need to be included in and supported in, not just included in and, cross your fingers and best of luck to you, student, but they also need supports in things like these non-academic activities, the social piece, right? That's social inclusion. And this involves their same age peers. It's really important that we're talking about same age, same grade level peers when we're thinking about social inclusion. And I think many educators, special educators and general educators are on board even with this idea of social inclusion, right? Sure, bring them in to have these experiences with their peers and make friends and include them in lunch and recess and things like that. I don't think there's a lot of controversy about that as well. But then we get to the academic inclusion piece. In order for students with disabilities to be academically included, they need to be exposed to, and you'll hear me talk about that term a lot as well, exposure to content. They need to be exposed to and supported in grade level academic content. And I know that rocks some people's world sometimes to think about, especially our students with more significant disabilities, and trying to talk about involving them in grade level academic content seems like there's a big gap there, right? And there is for sure. But that's where we bring in things like accommodations, modifications, providing, universal design for learning strategies, unpacking standards or alternate standards if it's a student with a significant disability. All of these things help make that access to grade level content available. Again, remember, we're not saying that we are expecting the same volume of work, the same complexity of work, but the students have the right to access that content, to just sort of be there and soak it in and have these accommodations and modifications made so that it increases the likelihood that they're able to take in some of this content. But we can't just flat out say, we're not doing it. It doesn't make sense. It's too hard, right? We have to make efforts to make that content accessible. It can be really difficult to wrap your head around that idea, but it's really critical to getting to that part of the academic inclusion. This is again where that graphic that we just looked at comes into play, where fair doesn't necessarily mean equal, right? We're still going to be equitably exposing students to content, but we're not necessarily going to do it in the same way, and that's okay. And that is something that is more fair. It's not going to look the same. The instruction's not going to look the same. It really shouldn't look the same in a lot of cases. What we're focusing on is that right to access and not necessarily having everyone do the same thing or have the same expectations. So once we acknowledge that fair doesn't always mean equal, once we've got that down, we can start looking at sort of these other building blocks of an inclusive mindset. At the very base is going to be presumed competence, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But other important elements of having this inclusive mindset include sort of operating under this idea of the least dangerous assumption, and then finally having high expectations for all students, including our students with disabilities, even our students with significant disabilities. These three elements work together to improve outcomes for all students. We're going to talk about more of them in detail, more about each of them in detail, but essentially, to sum these up, presuming competence means that we're going to start off by assuming students that are inherently capable, and that we as the educator need to work to find ways to allow those capabilities to emerge. I often compare this to, there's this idea that many times for our students with disabilities, and especially significant disabilities, it isn't that there's a lack of ability, but there's a lack of opportunity. And you'll hear me talk about that as we move forward as well. So we really need to focus on providing the opportunities and assuming that there is going to be some benefit there, and then working to make sure that we make that benefit accessible. The second building block is least dangerous assumption. And that really means that whenever we're making decisions about a student's learning or education, that the decisions we make are ultimately going to cause the least harm to their ability to function independently as an adult. And so that would mean making sure that they have access to opportunities, experiences, peers, settings, all these things, because we don't know for sure what students are capable of. We cannot, flip the top open on their head, peek in their brain, and know what's going on in there. All we have access to is what we see on the outside, but we do not know what's going on the inside of their brain. And so we have to make the least dangerous assumption in many cases, and we'll talk more about what that looks like exactly. It's not just automatically assuming, well, we'll just give them everything and do all the same things as their peers because we're going to assume that that's what's least dangerous for them, right? That's not what I'm advocating for at all. But last, high expectations. What this means is that we're not settling for status quo when it comes for our students with disabilities and especially significant disabilities. We're not going to settle for the status quo the way we've always done things in the past. We're going to be intentional about setting goals that are ambitious but reasonable for our students to work toward. So let's dig into these a little bit more. Here's presumed competence. So I really like this way of thinking about presumed competence, comparing it to a tree, right? So when we're thinking about a student, what we see is what we see on this tree. We see the leaves, we see the branches, we see the trunk, right? Those are the things that we can see. And it's easy to get caught up in thinking that those things that we see in a student are the whole thing, the whole tree, the whole student, right? But it's important to remember that there's a part of this tree or the part of the student that we can't see, the roots, right? There's still a part of the tree that we can't see. The roots in this instance, they represent the competence that we presume students to have, even though it may not be outwardly visible. And so again, as I've been mentioning already today, it's part of our responsibility as educators to provide sort of appropriate nourishment, right, to these roots in order for the tree or the student to thrive. Different trees are going to require different growing conditions. Different students may require different learning conditions or supports. The point is that it's critical for us to recognize that when a student has difficulties either demonstrating their knowledge, demonstrating their abilities, demonstrating their skills that they have, we can't interpret that as evidence that there's incompetence in that student, right? It just means that they haven't demonstrated that they do know something, but that isn't the same thing as demonstrating that they for sure don't know that, if that makes sense, right? So that's where this quote comes in about absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. So we're, just because we can't see direct evidence of competence in our students doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This really is true for all students, honestly, all people, really, when we think about that, we can't judge a book by its cover. What you see is not always what you get, those kinds of things, right? But especially for our students with more significant disabilities, they're so often reduced to a label, to an IQ score, and then we use that as sort of quick hints about, okay, their IQ is, in this range. I know that I can expect XYZ out of them and probably not much more or something like that, right? But the simple fact that a student's IQ has been identified as lower, or maybe that they have complex physical, challenges or communication challenges, those things don't automatically mean that they're incapable. Is it possible that those disabilities are preventing them from doing something or knowing something? Absolutely. But do we know that for sure? No, we don't. So the key piece here, I would say the key piece here is that students are often more capable than we realize, but it does require effort and creativity and collaboration on our part in order to be providing an environment in which those students can actually demonstrate that capability. Again, that goes back to the thought about it's not necessarily a lack of ability, but perhaps a lack of opportunity. So here's where I'm going to want to hear from you again. So as I review some of these things on this slide here, I want to hear from you in the chat box about ways that you feel that you demonstrate presumed competence, or that you as an administrator encourage your teachers and other staff members to demonstrate presumed competence for your students or in your students. be thinking about that and start adding your answers in the chat box. And I'm going to review some things here about how, when we presume competence in our students, how that can influence so many different things. So when we are presuming competence in our students, we're influencing how actively we engage the student. If we assume that that student has an ability within them, we're going to be more likely to engage them in what's going on, rather than sort of thinking, this is too hard, or they don't really get this, I'm just going to sort of let it go and move on and keep going, right? We're going to more actively engage the student, and that in turn leads to them being more actively engaged themselves in their education, just from the simple fact of, we assume you have some capabilities in there, kid, and we're going to find them. It's also going to influence how often we speak to the student, how often we talk to them, what kind of tone we use when we speak to them, and how we speak about that student to other people. So again, if you inherently believe that a student with a disability is capable, and I'm especially thinking about students with more significant disabilities right now, and even especially ones who have a lot of difficulties communicating, maybe they don't have an identified mode of communication yet, we still have to be keeping these principles in mind, of thinking about, we presume competence in you, student, and we will talk to you often. We will use an appropriate tone, right? We won't talk to you like you're a baby or like you're much younger than you really are. We're going to speak to you or speak about you as, an individual who has, that we respect, rather than, a younger or less capable person, that kind of a thing. So those are really, really important ideas. Another thing that we influence is, when we're presuming competence, we influence the complexity of information and the materials that we offer. That makes sense, right? And then also, this is the most important one to me, I think. When we presume competence in our students, it influences how much effort and patience we use as educators to resolve challenges. And this especially, I think, is relevant to administrators, in that when we think about inclusion and facilitating inclusion for students with disabilities, especially those with significant disabilities, that affects a lot of things like scheduling and staffing, available resources, supporting and sort of facilitating a collaborative environment where multiple staff members are coming together to make these things happen. But if you have an underlying belief that you don't presume a lot of competence in students with significant disabilities, that, mostly you were just there to kind of keep them safe and happy, and send them home at the end of the day and do it again tomorrow, right? Certainly we want them to be safe and happy, but there's so much more, right? And so when you have a belief of presuming competence in students, you're going to have a lot more patience for resolving challenges that arise from trying to include these students in general education. You're going to be willing to put forth a lot more effort, because you know that good things are going to come from it, right? That there's meaning and benefit that will be derived from that. The difference in how we approach students who we presume to be competent versus how we approach students who we presume to be less competent for whatever reason, that difference is dramatic, and it ultimately impacts students' future outcomes. And so that's why I put this background on this slide with the ripples. The simple fact of presuming competence or not in a student is sort of the drop that comes down, and then everything that happens after that ripples out, whether you presume competence in that student or not. Really, really important. So I see that we're being shy this morning. We're not having a lot of thoughts on ways in which we as educators presume competence or encourage our staff members to presume competence. Is there anyone who would prefer to unmute and share their thoughts on presuming competence? Okay, let's charge right ahead. We're going to get to the second building block in an inclusive mindset now, which is the least dangerous assumption. In essence, this really just refers to the idea, again, like I mentioned earlier, when we're not sure what a student is capable of, we as educators should make decisions that ultimately have the least harmful impact on that student's ability to be as independent as possible. Oftentimes, as teachers, as administrators, we make decisions that make things easier for the student and ourselves in the moment, right? We want things to be easier. We'll make decisions so that this is easier on this student or easier on this staff member or on our schedule or whatever. in the moment, but in the long run, those decisions can interfere with that student's ability to function independently. So we have to be able to consider both the short-term perspective and the long-term perspective. Choosing what's easier for a student in the short term could lead to less independence on their part in the future. But on the flip side, putting in the hard work now could lead to greater independence for that student down the line. So it's really important to remember and try to keep in mind a balance of those two ideas. Considering these two scenarios is really the easiest way that I've found to illustrate this idea of least dangerous assumption. So here's the first scenario. What if we presume competence in a student with disabilities? We give them every opportunity to learn what their same age peers are learning. But one day we find out, maybe through some magical brain scanning technology, because I said to you earlier, right, we don't know for sure what's going on in their brain. We can't know for sure. But let's say this magical brain scanning technology comes out and we find out that student just simply doesn't have the capabilities that we originally presumed. What harm has been done to that student in that scenario? We assumed they could learn. We gave them every opportunity. Turns out they didn't have the capabilities we assumed. Not much harm has been done in that instance, right? On the other hand, if we assume that the presence of a disability, even a significant disability, a cognitive or intellectual disability, if we assume that the presence of that disability means that a student can't learn, we might not give them every opportunity to do so. And then imagine that magical brain scanning technology comes out and shows that the student did, in fact, have this greater ability to learn than we first imagined. What harm has been done to that student in the long run? A lot, right? A lot. It's really important for us to be able to hold that idea in mind that what we see is not always what we get, right? And so then us as we as the decision makers have to be able to make decisions that are ultimately least harmful in the long run for students. So in summary, I think the best way to sum up this idea is really just to say that operating under the least dangerous assumption means that we're going to have high expectations for all students. And that leads us into talking about high expectations. So if we're thinking about making the least dangerous assumption, just to draw this into some legal aspects here for a moment, right? We're going to make sure that at a minimum, when we're operating under the least dangerous assumption, that students have access to the general education setting and the curriculum to the maximum extent appropriate. How many times have you heard that? To the maximum extent appropriate, right? We hear it in our sleep as special educators. But I want to be really clear here that when we talk about something being to the maximum extent appropriate, we are not meaning to the maximum extent convenient for other people. I think a lot of times that is what the default becomes in a case conference or in other conversations about programming for students. When we think about it's not appropriate for a student to be in a particular setting or whatnot, it really comes down to it's not convenient for us. We don't have the programming set up. We don't have our schedule set up the right way. We don't have the enough people or the right kind of people or something like that. But that's not what it means to be appropriate under IDEA here when we're thinking about what least restrictive environment means. So physical access to gen ed, that used to be what we aimed for, but we are, again, needing to move beyond that physical access. We're also needing to consider intellectual access, social access as well. And just really keep in mind that idea of the maximum extent appropriate is not always the maximum extent convenient. And what I will say too is when I'm emphasizing the importance of inclusion for all students, regardless of the significance of their disability, I am not saying that the only right answer then is 100% inclusion in gen ed setting no matter what. There is still a continuum of services for a reason. And we recognize that, right? We're not advocating for 100% inclusion in gen ed all the time, but what we are saying is to have our eyes set on the importance of access to everything that general education students have access to. It may be that the access to that content needs to take place in a separate setting for whatever reason. Okay, that's okay. That's part of the continuum of services, right? But the access piece is critical. We can't just automatically think because a student has a certain IQ or a certain disability level, they go into this program within our school or our district, and that program takes place in this classroom, which happens to be separate from a gen ed classroom, and well, that's just how it goes, right? We have to be willing to open up that process and think more broadly about how can we make sure students are accessing everything they have the right to access. And when we do that, the physical access and the intellectual access, social access as well, that's really what true inclusion is looking like for us. Why am I harping on access so much? This puts it into perspective, I think, quite clearly. When students are able to have access to things, settings, peers, experiences, and so forth, that leads to participation. And as we know, when we are participating in things, engaged in things, that's what leads to learning, right? Students can't sort of generate this knowledge themselves. They have to have access to it. They have to participate in it. And they can't bring that to themselves. We as the educators have to let them in to the classroom, to the setting, to the ability to be with their peers and so forth, right? So students can't learn what they're not taught or what they're not giving access to. So the access is critical to learning. That's it. You may wonder, especially I know having a crowd of administrators here, that you may wonder how this could impact the general education teachers, the general education classrooms, and so forth. I know that accountability through assessments and things like that is critical for schools as well, and that many educators can be concerned that if we're increasing inclusion of students with disabilities, especially those with significant disabilities, by increasing that inclusion, that's going to take away time from students with fewer needs or less intense needs, or that perhaps you're concerned that students with disabilities are somehow unable to have their needs met in those increased gen ed settings. But good news, research over time shows that simply isn't true. On a daily basis, of course, there could certainly be situations where there are interruptions that occur, lessons are less seamless than we planned, things don't go the way we want. But I'm here to tell you that research has proven over time, again and again, that long-term student achievement is not affected by the inclusion of students with disabilities, regardless of the significance of that disability. This doesn't mean that there isn't a fair amount of work involved, right, and a fair amount of planning that has to take place in order for these outcomes to happen, to remain high and beneficial for all. But the simple fact that we're including students with disabilities in more gen ed settings doesn't impact anyone's achievement, gen ed students or the students with disabilities who are being included. Short term, of course, bumps in the road happen, but we need to look at it from a higher, broader view, and achievement just simply isn't impacted in the long term, which I think is really important to recognize when we're thinking about moving forward with inclusion. All right, finally to the high expectations. Again, I mentioned earlier, and I will say it again, when we're talking about having high expectations for our students with disabilities, that's not the same thing as having unreasonable expectations, the same expectations that we have for our students without identified disabilities. Remember, fair doesn't always mean equal. But when I'm talking about high expectations now, really for any student, why I feel like that is so important is, and I think this graphic does a great job of showing it, that we are making room for those students to grow. That's what the red arrow is showing. So if we keep our expectations low, really no one is motivated to go above a low expectation, right? If you've met the expectation, that's it. So if they're low, that's all the farther we can really expect anyone to go. But if we raise our expectations, we keep them high, not unreasonably high, but high, we make room for students to grow, right? They may not reach the ultimate highest expectation or that highest target, but we've made room for them to grow, right? If we keep it low, they're only going to be low. If we raise their expectation, at least now maybe they will get to here, right? Halfway, 3/4 of the way, quarter of the way, but that's more progress than they would have made otherwise with low expectations. So again, we can't know for sure what any student is capable of, but when we keep our expectations low, we're artificially stunting their growth, right? That they might have achieved otherwise. Yeah, someone is sharing in the chat box, expectations should be reasonable and appropriate, right? And again, got to be real careful when we think about what does that word appropriate mean, right? We can't get caught up in thinking, well, they have a significant intellectual disability, so this expectation is not appropriate, right? We got to leave the labels out of it. We got to leave the IQ scores out of it. And we really have to focus on access and then how we appropriately facilitate that access. Absolutely, yeah, we have to. But again, in saying that we're having high expectations for students, we're not saying that we're being unreasonable, right? So that's really all I have to say about high expectations. I will briefly flash these next two slides for you just to show you that these are some great look-fors as administrators if you're doing walkthroughs with teachers in classrooms, and you want to know, how can I be sure that my teachers are reflecting high expectations for my students, for our students. This slide shows some ways that you'll see them reflecting high expectations more academically. The next slide will show some where they will be reflecting high expectations more in that sort of social emotional way. So I won't read through all of these, but I will point out the one that is, I think, most important here is providing wait time. So either when you've asked a question of a student or given a student a direction, providing wait time, providing enough wait time is, I mean, it's critical. It is critical to what happens after you ask the question or give the direction, right? We know that students with disabilities, especially those with more significant disabilities, they have some processing challenges and things like that. They're going to require additional wait time. It can get uncomfortable for the adults, right? Man, we're waiting a long time. We got a lot of stuff to do. We got to move on. I don't have time for this. Come on, let's go. Let me prompt them again. All that does is restart that student having to process the question again or process the direction again. So if you can get comfortable with waiting and waiting and waiting after a question or a direction is given, you will find that students are more likely to have a response, right? And even if they don't, at the end of all that waiting, what we have done by providing that wait time is indicate to that student that we believe they have something valuable to contribute. And that is so huge for our students with disabilities, that we're not just rushing them through their school day after day after day. We got something else to get to. I don't have time for this, and so forth. We're going to indicate to them that we believe they have something of value to contribute, and we're going to make space for them to process that and sort of come up with that to be able to share it. I really can't emphasize the importance of wait time enough there. Here are the social emotional pieces. I won't get into that much because I want to get on to some other things here, but know that that's there for you to refer to later. I want to hear from you all now. Again, I've been doing a lot of talking today, which is fine. I'm happy to share the information, but I really want to hear from you all in terms of what instructional strategies either do you use or do you promote in your schools as administrators, and do you look for as you're doing walkthroughs? What happens in your schools and in your districts that reflect high expectations for students? And as you're thinking about that, sort of a side follow-up question to that would also be, how are you ensuring that students have access to grade level content? And if you're not, how are you thinking differently about how you might provide access? As you're thinking, I'm going to keep going, but please share your thoughts in the chat box. Speaking of access, when we're thinking about what expectations are happening in the gen ed setting and how then we can make those appropriate for our students with disabilities, I've mentioned several times already, and of course, most everyone is aware of accommodations and modifications and how important those are to educating our students with disabilities. But I wanted to sort of bring this to bear here, bring this to the forefront so that we can really clarify what it means to accommodate versus what it means to modify, and what that might look like on the next slide here. So when we're accommodating something, that means we're changing how the content is taught, how it's accessed, things like that. But when we're modifying it, we're changing the actual expectation of mastery, right? So if we're accommodating for students maybe with more high incidence disabilities who are still on diploma track, things like that, we don't want to be modifying for those students. We want to be accommodating. We want to change our strategies that we use in order to teach the content, in order how the content is accessed by the student, how they're demonstrating their knowledge, right? We're going to be using a ton of UDL strategies in doing this, but that ultimately doesn't change the expectation of mastery for those students. When we're thinking about students with the most significant disabilities who are sort of in that 1%, right, that we think of sometimes, who are not on diploma track, who are getting some kind of alternate certificate, things like that, that's where we're looking about modifying. And that's where we are able to make grade level content accessible to them, because we're going to make these modifications. We're changing the expectation of mastery, but we're still going to expose them to that content. Here's an example of what that might look like. This is a series of steps here that are general education expectations, maybe in writing an essay or a report of some kind, right? You select a topic, you identify similarities and differences within that topic, paraphrase resources, organize those details into a cohesive paper, and then present it in some way, right? Read it aloud to the class. But if those are the gen ed expectations, then here what these other columns show is how could we potentially accommodate that for a student who we need to keep those expectations of mastery the same, but we still need to change the way that that student is accessing it. And then how might we potentially modify it? So we do need to be changing the expectation of mastery a little bit, but we still want that student participating in the general gist of what's going on with those gen ed expectations. More important than what is actually listed here in the table is the concept of structuring it in this way. So I highly, highly encourage you to support your teachers in breaking down their assignments in this way. If you're thinking about how in the world am I supposed to be making gen ed assignments or gen ed expectations accessible to students with disabilities, think about breaking it down in this way. Identify the priority skills, the priority concepts, the priority steps within a lesson or an assignment or something like that. List those down the side. And then you go and think, okay, well, if this is what I want, all students to do, or the majority of students to do, how might I change that for a student who needs an accommodation? Or how might I change that for a student who needs a modification? Just having a structure in that way, rather than looking at an entire lesson or an entire assignment or something like that and thinking, okay, now I have to make this accessible to a student with a disability. I don't know how to do that. That's too overwhelming, right? There's too much going on there. Think about structuring it in this way. What are the key priorities for all students to get out of it? And then how can you accommodate or modify each one of those key priorities? That is what I want you to get out of this slide, more so than the examples that are actually given here, just thinking about structuring it in that way. We are nearing the end of our time together, so I want to make sure I get to these last couple slides that have a lot of resources on them for either for you or for you to share with teachers and other staff members in your building. So we've talked a lot about presuming competence, why we should do it, but there's still sort of this lingering question of how to make it all work. So each of these elements that are listed here in these bubbles, they play a part in supporting high expectations for students with disabilities and making sure that those students have appropriate access to grade level content. Honestly, we could do a days long training on really any and all of these bubbles themselves. So I don't mean to imply that we're solving all the problems today, but I do want to first call out that these are the things that you'll want to focus on when you're thinking about how am I going to support high expectations in my building or in my district. But then too, on the next slide here, I'll share some resources within each of those um, categories so that you have a jumping off point, right? So in the chat box, if you're willing and would like to, I'm curious to know if there's an area here listed on the slide that you feel particularly comfortable in. Like, oh yeah, we've got unpacking standards in the bag. We're on it. We're rock stars at unpacking standards. But I'm not so sure about, universal design for learning. That's something that we could really use some help with. Just curious to know how you feel, within your building, within your district, how you feel you rank, I guess, in each of those areas. And while you're thinking about that, I want to share with you these resources. So these are the same categories on the previous slide. And I apologize for the closed captioning being on that bottom one, but you'll be able to see it all on the presentation that's uploaded to our website. So these are the same categories that were listed on the previous slide, but what I've done here is pull out a couple of key resources for each one. So if you're in a place where you really feel like, man, I hear a lot about universal design for learning, sounds like a good idea, don't really know if we're doing it right or implementing it to the fullest extent, there are a couple of resources listed here that I would recommend as fabulous, fabulous places to get started. Same thing for, gen ed alignment or specially designed instruction. These are just some places to start. So I wanted you to be able to walk away with these resources here in thinking about how you're going to move forward now that we've emphasized this idea of presuming competence with students and having meaningful inclusion, right? No longer just the physical inclusion, but we're really making it more meaningful. These resources will help you get to that point. Heidi shared in the chat box that the presentation is on our website here on the Summer Institute page. She shared that link for you, so you'll be able to access this presentation, as well as all the links that are within here. That brings us really to essentially the end of our time together. I just want to emphasize one more time here that really the long story short in all of this is that if you're tempted to say, I can't, have the courage to add yet. And that goes for students as well as adults, right? We don't want our students to get in that sort of learned helplessness phase, but we don't want us as adults to get in that phase either. If this all sounds very complicated and like too much, can't do it, don't get it, you know, whatever. I can't do meaningful inclusion for students with disabilities or students with significant disabilities. Have the courage to add yet today. Yes, there's going to be a lot of work involved, a lot of planning, a lot of reaching out for different resources, a lot of working together as a team to make this happen. But it's so important that we have that as our target, the meaning, that we're meaningfully including our students, because we may not ever see how that comes to fruition for our students, right? We may never see the impact of that in the year or two or a handful of years that they're in our building. But when we plant those seeds, when we lay the groundwork, that means that later these things, the seeds may sprout, right? Or the pieces may be put together. And so it's up to us to make sure that all of those seeds have been planted and that all of those, structural pieces have been laid, that we're making the least dangerous assumption so that later in life, if the pieces can come together or if some other opportunity is presented, that those pieces can come together for that student. It's our job to figure out how to sort of build a bridge to that yet, right? We can't do it right now maybe, but we're going to find a way to get to yet. Students can't do this. I can't do this. We just got to get to yet, right? I would be really curious to hear if you have any questions for me, comments on anything that we discussed today. Hopefully, maybe if I be quiet for a minute, you can access this QR code for the session evaluation. I really, really value your input and would love to hear from you on how the session went and if you would change anything or add anything to it. You can use the QR code. You can type in this bit.ly address that's here. I think Heidi will be putting the evaluation link in the chat as well in a moment. So hang in there for that evaluation.
It's already in there, Ashley.
Oh, there it is. Thank you,
yeah.
Thank you.
Stephanie has a question. She can't find the PowerPoint. If you want to go ahead and
sure.
Show her.
Yes, I can do that in just a second. Let me follow up with these last couple slides and welcome my CAT co-presenter here. So I didn't want to miss the opportunity to share with you some upcoming opportunities from Project Success. We're so glad that you're here with us today for our Summer Institute, but we've also got opportunities for the upcoming school year. So each of these links here, which I can show you how to get to as well, gives you the chance to learn more about our Playbook platform, which is an online professional development, sort of professional learning platform. We have a playbook for special education teachers. We also have a playbook that's specific for sort of developing teacher leaders. And then for new teachers, and we really consider those to be maybe anywhere from 0 to 3-ish years of experience in special education, we have a new teacher jumpstart coming up in August, and you can learn more there. But that'll really focus on getting a lot of those foundational skills that special education teachers need to be successful. So those are just a couple opportunities coming up. And then lastly, I want to make sure that you have all the different ways to follow up with us. So if you have questions or think of anything after the fact, you're welcome to email me. My email address is there, aquick@pcgus.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We share a lot of our upcoming professional development opportunities there, as well as just different articles and resources and things. And underneath the closed captioning there, you can sign up for our newsletter. That's on our website as well. And that includes the same kinds of opportunities and information and resources as well. So lots of different ways to connect with us. And I have lost my chat box, but I will go and show you all how to find the PowerPoint. Are there any questions while I am figuring this out?